Hello, this is the Politics and Letters podcast. I'm David Barfield with Jim Livingston, and today we're going to be speaking with Bruce Robbins, who is a English and comparative literature professor at Columbia University, and most recently wrote the book Atrocity, and Norman Finkelstein, who received his PhD from the Princeton University Politics Department in 1987. He's the author of many books that have been translated into 60 editions, foreign editions, including The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, and most recently, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. And with that, welcome, everybody. Norman, I wanted to start with a bit of chronology with respect to the book. And I wanted to get your take on this, if I'm reading it correctly, because I've watched a lot of your interviews over the past 2.5 years in podcasts and so forth. And the book came out originally in early 23, give or take, but well prior to October 7th, and initially not well received in many quarters. In liberal and left circles, you caught a lot of criticism for some of the positions you took. And this was because of your critique of identity politics, woke politics, and its, I would say, further, the theoretical foundations under which it operates. So then October 7th happens, and you become, let's say, far less of a pariah in those same circles. But the thing I found interesting in this is that your position currently on Palestine, let's say, is informed by the same politics which are in the book, that you lay out in the book. And I just wanted to see if is that perception of mine, let's say, is that an accurate description of what's happened with you after the book and after October 7th?
To my knowledge, and I could be mistaken at this point, there was very little, if any, public criticism of the I'll Burn That Bridge book. To my knowledge, it was not reviewed in any periodical. I could be wrong about that, but I don't recall any print or web periodical that reviewed the book. What was true was it was very negatively received privately by friends, comrades, and former publishers. Nobody, whether it was at Metropolitan Books, whether it was at New Left Review, Verso Books, or Books, not only would they not touch it with a barge pole, but they were very critical of its contents. And I have to say, I'm not made of, I don't have steel armor, and I was very unsure how to proceed after I received all the very negative criticism. And if I could just say just a brief anecdote, my final arbiter on the question of whether to publish it was to send it to Professor Chomsky. And even though he had been my mentor for about 40 years, and I counted him as a friend, we hadn't been in contact very much the last 8 or so years since the passing of his wife, his first wife, with whom I was also very close. And I didn't want to burden him. He was on in years. And nonetheless, I was so conflicted about the book that I sent it to him. And I said, look, A, B, and C don't like it. D, E, and F hate the book. And G, H, and I said I would be committing professional suicide if I published it. So I want to hear your opinion. And I waited for his opinion with trepidation, for sure, because I spent quite a lot of time, I invested quite a lot of time in writing the book. I sat down and I read bodies of literature, which I hadn't touched. Literally, I hadn't touched since college. Um, and I got back an email from him, and he wrote, quote, "If you have any doubts about publishing this book, don't." And when I saw the word don't, my heart dropped. I read it as, if you have any doubts about publishing this book, don't, as in don't publish it. And the next sentence read, of course you should publish it. And it went on. So when I got the green light from him, I effectively, I don't want to say anything rude, but I effectively said, F everybody else, I'm going to go ahead with it. And then the second big point of validation for me came from Dr. Cornel West. And I asked him to read the book because I was going to interview him. I did 4 hours of interview with him. Never got posted for reasons I can't go into now. And he was extremely generous in his praise of the book. So I felt if I have Professor Chomsky and if I have Dr. West on my side, okay, I'll go ahead and we'll see what happens. As Napoleon famously said, on s'engage, puis on voit. I'll see what happens. And I think you're accurate in saying that the criticism of the book has diminished significantly. And I think personally the reason was identity politics, or I should say woke politics, was basically a creature of the Democratic Party. We had a version of it in the 1990s. It was called political correctness. And for those who have forgotten, it was the left that coined the phrase PC. It was a form of self-mockery of these apparatchiks on the left. But political correctness was very much a college and a confined to colleges and universities, a certain sector of those institutions. Woke politics was something altogether different. It had been weaponized by the Democratic Party. It meant huge amounts of money. I mean, really, we're talking about big bucks in order to subsidize this ideological weapon. And then the turning point was not October 7th. The turning point was the presidential election, which meant a very significant defeat for the whole identity politics mentality. And then on top of that came the attempts by President Trump to weaponize identity politics or weaponize the opposition to identity politics by going after colleges and universities. And so this huge woke culture came under ferocious attack. And I think at that point, people were willing to hear out, well, maybe there is a problem here with the way so-called left culture and then Democratic Party culture or Democratic Party institutions appropriated this phenomenon. So I believe the turning point was the defeat of Kamala Harris, and then the Trump administration's weaponizing of the harsh criticism of woke politics. The Republicans, what they did was they capitalized on the alleged anti-Semitism, which began under the Biden administration, and then decided to use that as the tip of the spear. It began with the alleged anti-Semitism on college and university campuses, but then under Trump, it expanded to DEI and all of these so-called woke politics.
All right, Jim?
Um, Hi. Yeah, I got to say, you use the word conflicted early on in describing how you felt about publishing the book, and it, I'm conflicted too, and here's why. It seems that the the criticism you make, which it seems to be fairly characterized as an attack on identity politics, has now been weaponized and accomplished under Trump. But that can't possibly satisfy you as someone of the left. So I wonder if one way to get at that, the unintended consequence, if you will, of this critique, is to ask: Is this the logical fulfillment of a commitment to politics as it is constrained, confined, and closed by a liberal sensibility? And by that I mean the same sensibility that Richard Rorty brought to his critique of identity politics in Achieving Our Country, which comes down to this, and I think it comes down to the same thing in your book. And again, this is a question. I'm not sure about this. That if identity politics is at its core about representation, that's where you begin, and I think that's how the argument develops. But no group can be safely represented by any one individual. Therefore, it seems to me the atomic particles of politics get reduced to the individual, at least logically. All right. But that leaves us as people on the left with a real problem then. How do we represent collectively the interests, say, of the working class or of Black people in terms of racial solidarity, if not outright nationalism? So I'm conflicted, and I'm not trying to draw attention to some contradiction here. I'm wondering if there's a problem here for you now.
Would you like me to answer now or let the others speak?
I don't know. It's up to you.
You go ahead, Norman.
Okay. I think I'm not happy at all that it's the Trump administration which is carrying out the so-called, so to speak, carrying out the housekeeping in academia. I don't like their brooms. I don't like their equipment. Obviously, that shouldn't have to even be said, given my political pedigree. On the other hand, one has to accept, if you want a real left at this particular juncture, at this particular moment, I believe you can't just adopt the position that anything that Trump says is untrue or anything that Trump says should be condemned. I could use the cliche, a broken clock is right twice a day. But I think in every sphere, let's just take the case right now of the hearings in the Senate with RFK Jr. So if you remember, Elizabeth, if you listen to the hearings, Elizabeth Warren and several others came down hard on RFK on the issue of the vaccine booster for COVID and the fact that RFK won't recommend it and therefore it's going to be costly. I talked to some physicians of mine, friends of mine, who are not politically dogmatic and for that matter, not very much politically engaged. They said to me, I'm against the COVID booster. He says, one friend said, we're immunized every day to COVID by just human contact. I don't support the booster. He said, the booster is just big pharma. They make a huge amount of money. It's the same thing every medical person has to take the flu shot. And my friend said, that's completely crazy because the flu shot is based on the strain of the flu from last year. if the strain of the flu this year is different, the flu shot does nothing. But it's a huge moneymaker. So my friend said, I think it's true. The CDC does need a revamping. Now, you might say, well, that's just your friend. But here's the thing. Bernie Sanders, for two presidential primaries, he ran his whole campaign not trivially, on big pharma, and how crooked our medical system is. And then suddenly, when he's on with RFK, he's saying, but what about the American Medical Association? And what about the American Pediatric Association? And are you saying they're wrong? Well, Bernie, for 8 years, you were saying they were wrong. You were saying they were part of the problem. And now all of a sudden, you're defending that same medical establishment that you had devoted 8 years to denouncing as part of big pharma. And it's the same thing with Trump. It's regrettable that he or his administration has become the bearer of the bad news. But the woke politics, not only was it intellectually vacuous, but it was a complete political disaster. If you take the most obvious case where Bruce Robbins can weigh in and disagree with me, fine, I have no problem with that. For the whole woke period, we were hearing that if a particular professor or a particular book or a particular statement made a student of a minority group feel unsafe, uncomfortable, or unwanted, then they should be canceled. The criteria was unsafe, unwelcome, unwanted. Then they should be canceled. And I wrote in my book, I'll Burn That Bridge, that's a disastrous path to go down, because it's only a matter of time before Jewish students are going to say that this Palestinian speaker makes me feel unsafe, unwanted, and unsafe, unwanted, and whatever the thing, unwelcome. And that's what happened. That's how I am not saying that if they hadn't adopted the woke criteria for free speech, that the Jewish billionaire class and then the Trump administration would not have succeeded. Probably the pressure was so overwhelming with the money issue, they would have anyhow succeeded. But the whole woke culture made it so easy. There was no longer a freedom of speech argument available. I'm not saying, and I repeat, that the freedom of speech argument would have carried the day. Probably not. But there was no way to answer it because you yourself had adopted those criteria, those standards for speech. So not only was it, as I said, politically, intellectually vacuous, but it was politically a disaster what happened.
Can I jump in a little bit?
Sure.
So, Norman, I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree with what you just said. I do think that we on the left are in part responsible for overplaying the oversensitivity card, and we, in particular, Jewish critics of Israel, are paying the price for it now in exactly the way that you said. I have my own story to tell, along those lines. So, no, I think you're right. While we're talking about you and your career, I want to say that for me, you will never be the opponent of woke culture. You are the hero of Jewish anti-Zionism. And you have made it possible for so many of us to speak up in a way we never would have dared speak up before you got yourself in such a shitstorm of trouble. But you and Chomsky both, in some ways, have made it possible for there to be many of us now, which leads me to say, I think we are many in another sense also. That is to say, we on the left who have expressed impatience with the Democratic Party's identity politics fixation, there are now many of us. So, I mean, I know you're attached to the burning bridges metaphor that you put into your title, which suggests that, everyone else is crossing these bridges and you're burning them. But in fact, there are lots of us now on the left who agree with you completely that it was a sort of dead end for the Democratic Party to box itself in the way it did. And now I think, Mamdani is one bit of evidence of impatience with that. I do want to ask you a question. I hope this is not spoiling the agenda that David and Jim have for our. This is about free speech absolutism. So I'm not a free speech absolutist. I probably have thought a lot less about this than you have. So I'm really open to correction. But when our president of Columbia University testified in Congress and was asked about the support for genocide among pro-Palestinian protesters, I wanted her to say, if there had been support for genocide in these protests, we would not have allowed it. But as it happens, nothing that was said in those protests really was support for genocide. So, there was nothing that I didn't have to do anything. There wasn't any. And my kind of debater point instance of this takes me back to Joan Peters, because you accomplished such an incredible task for us all in showing what a piece of crap from time immemorial was. So my question is, it's kind of not fair, but I ask it anyway. She never got her BA, but let's suppose she had a job in academia and you came along and you said, this piece of scholarship, supposed scholarship that she wrote, is completely fraudulent and a sham. Would that, according to your criteria, be grounds for questioning her professional competence and whether she deserves to be teaching people?
Well, I believe that one question conflates so many discrete issues that I can't answer it with a, as it were, yes or no, because or even an expanded answer, I have to break it down into parts. So let's start with part one. First of all, regarding Shafiq's testimony before the Congressional Committee, I remember one person commented afterwards, it was very striking that there were two words she never mentioned in all of her testimony. There were two words never mentioned. You know what the two words were?
Academic freedom.
Never mentioned. Maybe you were the one that said it. I don't remember.
I did, actually. That's fine.
The two words that were never mentioned were academic freedom. So she was already beside the point. There was no even point in engaging this person because she had abdicated her fundamental responsibility to defend academic freedom. Having said that, I think it's important to bear in mind in any discussion of this sort to recall that, for better or for worse, the American tradition, the Supreme Court tradition on free speech has very few limits. In our country, you say you shouldn't be able to advocate genocide, okay? In our country, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just recalling what is the standard that any college president who says that he or she respects and will integrate into campus life the jurisprudence on free speech, the First Amendment jurisprudence. And most private universities have said that, even though they're private and not public, they say they will accept as the standard at their college or university what our jurisprudence says. So what does it say? You say advocating genocide is crosses a red line. In our country, you're allowed to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. For many people, that's crossing a red line. In our country, you have the constitutional right to burn the American flag. Now, if you read that decision, people like Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice at the time, he wrote this very long dissent, quoting, you probably know the poem, I wasn't familiar with it, a very long poem about our flag. I think that poem ran to around 3 pages in his dissent. And you could see, and I could understand it, frankly, how anguished and tormented and tortured he was or felt at the prospect of burning the American flag. He talked about Iwo Jima and raising the American flag. He talked about all the soldiers marching in battle, holding high the American flag. But he lost. Actually, on the majority side, I was surprised, was Scalia. On the question of the right to burn the American flag, the majority voted yes. There was a case that came before the court. Now, listen to this case. It's not so old, so you'll probably remember it from reading in the newspaper. A guy is being buried in a cemetery, and some people come out from some evangelical, or I can't remember what sect, and they're holding up signs saying at a demonstration right outside the cemetery, holding up signs saying fags should die, good that he's dead. Went to the Supreme Court, they upheld the right.
Right. Can I jump in for a second? Because I'm sure you quote more cases.
Yeah.
But all right, you probably know this. There's some controversy as to whether academic freedom and free speech really need to be discriminated from each other. Personally, I think they're not the same thing at all. And the history which you actually talk about in your book, going back to 1915, all that stuff, we're not going to go into it, really has to do with a certain amount of professional autonomy, which is to say, professional academics get to decide what's a minimum level of competence. And that's really different from free speech. So, for example, flat earthers and creationists in a physics department, the physicists have the right to say, sorry, you don't have the right to teach creationism or flat earth in a physics department. This would lower the level. We're not going to do balance on this. So professional competence.
Yes,
I think John Peters is a good example of.
I addressed that in the book, and I said, just to the sake of the other two persons here, and also for the audience, what Bruce said is one has to make a distinction between freedom of speech and academic freedom. And there is places where they are separate, they are discrete, and there are places where they overlap. So let's just look at it quickly. Academic freedom basically meant 3 things in the history of our country, beginning with the statements by the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. It basically meant 3 things. Number 1, the best judge of the competence of a professor is his or her peers. That a politician, a clergy should not be deciding who will and will not be a member of the physics department. The competence to decide who and who isn't able to teach physics, that should be reserved to your peers. So that's the first pillar of academic freedom. The second pillar of academic freedom was that so long as you are a citizen of the country, a citizen of our country, that is, and outside academia, outside the ivory tower, that you have the same rights to freedom of speech as anybody else. That your right to free speech can't be limited because you are a professor. And the third aspect of academic freedom was and is, or should be, that within the ivory tower, that you should have complete freedom of thought to pursue your ideas, to pursue your research wherever it might take you. There should be no limits on your thought or speech within academia, but that's separate from academic competence. So let's say you have a professor who got tenure on the basis of his or her competence in physics, but then starts saying things in other areas which are, by some reckonings, bizarre. Should he or she have the right to speak on other topics and still retain his or her post as a physics professor? And from the principles of academic freedom, which include freedom of thought, wherever it might take you, within the university setting, the answer should be yes. So, you can have a professor like Shockley, who invented the, it just slipped my mind, the, transistor and the transistors for, in my day, what were called transistor radios, but then start to speak about the genetic endowments of Black and white people. Well, many people were outraged by his statements, but in his chosen field, I guess it was maybe it was electrical engineering. I can't remember right now which. In his chosen field, he was competent, and he has to be allowed to retain his job. That's academic freedom. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions. There are, moral outrages like which you can imagine of a sexual kind, which demonstrate complete moral delinquency. But in general, those were the principles. So I would say that our department has the right to maintain a standard of competence and judge who is and who isn't competent to speak, to teach. And I have to say, I said in the book, I'm very conflicted about having to acknowledge that because I paid a professional price.
Well,
the judgment was I wasn't competent, but I still accept there's no alternative. I still accept there's no alternative.
You no doubt know your case much better than I do, but the little bit that I know about your case, you were judged professionally competent by all the professionally competent people. There was no doubt about your professional competence. It was whether you were civil or something like that. And that was not decided by your peers. It was decided by the administration. Am I wrong about this?
I would say it's a myopic view of what happened because, Bruce, as the people who introduced me pointed out, I got my PhD in 1987. With that brief interlude of 2001 to 2007, I never could get any job. I could not get adjuncting jobs. And the grounds always by the department that I wasn't really a scholar, that I wasn't competent, that I had not published in scholarly journals, which was true, that I had not published with academic presses, which was predominantly true. So all the standards of academia were arrayed against me. I lost. Now, in the case of the pool, it's true I passed through two hoops, and the last hoop was It was the university committee which denied me the tenure. Exactly why, it's never been revealed. But I would say, speaking frankly, you ask yourself a simple question, which I bring up in the book. Do you think that Karl Marx would ever have passed muster for a job in academia? When you look at Marx and on his attacks on his colleagues in Das Kapital, his brutal put downs of everybody, of all of his peers, would he have got tenure? I don't believe it. I don't believe there's any chance he would have gotten tenure. But that's the way the system works. And I have to acknowledge, I don't see an alternative. I don't see an alternative.
It may be irrelevant, but let's not forget that Marx's father was a lawyer who was forbidden by the German authorities after 1815 to practice as a lawyer because he was Jewish. And he would have had Marx, if he had really wanted an academic career, he would have had to ask himself, what other obstacles am I going to be up against besides me saying unpopular things? I mean, I think you were saying unpopular things. It wasn't your Jewishness that stopped you from getting an academic job. It was the things you were saying.
Jim, did you?
Yeah, I remain confused here. Let me introduce my own case in terms of academic freedom. Just I want to do it briefly, but let me hear what you say. But may I preface this by saying there is an historical argument to be made on behalf of identity politics. I've made it in print and so forth, and I would like to somehow go back to that because the theoretical argument you make against it is very compelling. It's very cogent, but it does have to abstract from the historical experience, say, of Black people in order for it to be convincing. It seems to me, and I speak now as an historian. I'm not in a comp lit department. I'm not even in any department anymore. Okay, so my case was I went around the corner one night and the place was overrun with white children. So I came back home and I posted on Facebook, I now officially hate white people. And I resigned from the white race. I thought it was very funny. The HR department at Rutgers University, where I had retired from, brought me up on charges of racism and convicted me, right? Okay. The president stepped in, no problem. But since then, I have asked myself, well, wait a second. Shouldn't I have been judged in terms of my competence as an historian who actually did teach a lot about Black nationalism, about slavery, about the question of race in American history? Couldn't it have been legitimately said, well, yeah, you exercise your freedom of speech, but you also brought your expertise on American history and race relations in that history to bear. Therefore, perhaps you do not deserve the protections of extracurricular free speech.
I don't see the connection. I mean, I'm a little confused by what you're saying. You made a statement which doesn't seem to me to come bear on your academic competence to teach history.
Well, the response of HR and the response of the administration, at least initially, was I have violated the mission of the university by intimidating white students who might have enrolled in my classes.
It was your sense of humor.
You can't make that shit up. I know.
But got a lot of shit from the white nationalists too.
Right. But anyway, okay. So if I may, then, unless David, you want to
go ahead.
Okay, it seems to me the hero of your book, or the intellectual touchstone or gold standard. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. Is John Stuart Mill, who is a quintessential liberal, but also a decided utilitarian. And you also cite Bertrand Russell quite frequently, who was the godson of J.S. Mill. And Russell, by the way, was the godfather of good old Freddie Ayer. So anyway, how do you reconcile the idea of a free marketplace of ideas, which you also elaborate in terms of Emerson's freedom of speech book, with the idea that there has never been a free marketplace, whether we talk about the economy narrowly construed or civil society broadly construed. There's no such thing as a free marketplace. So why would we not, in fact, place stringent limitations on speech, whether on the university campus or not, in view of that obvious fact?
Well, there are several things to be said. Number one, you are correct that, in my opinion, the best exposition of the importance of free speech in terms of gaining clarity about the world, finding truth, and basing your politics on truth, the best exposition of that idea, I think, can be found in Mill's On Liberty. Now, as a person of the left, we used to say, quoting, I think if my memory is right, Gramsci or Lenin or many others, the expression we used was, the truth is revolutionary. We also always attached a great deal of value to truth. When you, and the greatest exponent of that value on the left, in my opinion, is Rosa Luxemburg, who I didn't quote sufficiently because when I wrote the book, a large amount of her writing was not yet available in English. Now there are 5 volumes available of her political writings, and you find a lot more in those 5 volumes about what she has to say about the importance of truth and freedom of speech. Most people quote what she had to say in her essay, The Russian Revolution, about the Bolsheviks, but actually, from early on, she was harping on the importance of free speech, and free speech as a prerequisite for finding truth. Now, you say there's never been a free marketplace of ideas, and of course, I agree. Just like academic freedom has never been free of political considerations, constraints, from which, and at this point in my life, I don't much care, but from which I personally had to pay a price. The political constraints embedded in academic freedom, the principle of peers judging your competence. But then the answer is, why would you then want to narrow the rights of free speech and not struggle to expand them, always bearing in mind that given the nature of our society, I dare call it a capitalist society, there will always be limits. But the question is, do you fight to expand those limits? Or do you go along with new constraints and encroachments? And to that, I will say 2 things. Number one, if you read the history of free speech in our country and how you gained the right, for example, to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, most, not all, but most of those cases that went before the Supreme Court were brought by people of the left. It was anarchists, it was communists, it was socialists. They were the ones struggling to expand the right to free speech in our country. One of the heroes of my book is Paul Robeson. And people will remember that the line in The House I Live In, there was a song called The House I Live In, and the line which always evoked huge applause from the audience was, quote, "The right to speak my mind out, that's America to me." The right to speak my mind out, that's America to me. So the whole left tradition was about trying to expand the boundaries of free speech, of course, knowing full well that there are certain limits that under our currently constituted system, we will never be able to breach. Secondly, as the events post October 7th revealed in a painful way, and as Nadine Strassen, the former president of the ACLU, documents at length in her little book on free speech called Hate, whenever you enact those laws, the first people who suffer from them when you try to limit the free speech because of people's feelings in order to protect minorities. She goes through the whole case of Europe, where Europe, as you know, has all these hate speech laws. And you know who's the first people to suffer from those laws? Even in the UK, when they enacted their hate speech laws in 1965, who were the first people to suffer in the UK? Black people. They were the first ones held for violating the laws. In each of these countries, in Hungary, in France, elsewhere, it was always the victims who were supposed to be protected who ended up being the targets of the hate speech laws. And that's exactly what happened after October 7th. That the whole woke left, which was in the vanguard of putting all these constraints on free speech, for arguments like the one you made, well, there's never been a free marketplace of ideas, and the ruling class will protect its rights, but will never protect your rights. Yeah, and it was all then weaponized against those who these constraints were supposed to protect. So I say on two grounds. One, maybe people will believe that Mill's argument is not argument, arguments. You might believe that his arguments are truisms, but truisms or not, it's very simple. Unless you claim to be God, you have no monopoly on truth.
Absolutely.
And the person who dissents from you, even if it's one person, might have the truth, and the overwhelming majority might be wrong. It's a truism, but a truism is a truism because it's true. So if you care about truth, and I devoted an entire life to trying to uncover lies and be fastidiously accurate in making sure every footnote, every period, and every comma is accurate, because I believe in that notion that the truth is revolutionary. I'm not about now to give it up because of some passing fad. I found it really revolting. If I can give two examples. In my day, I don't know how old you guys are, but in my day, the people on the left would say about academia, except for Paul Baran at Stanford, there wasn't one Marxist economist tenured at any major university in our country. And we always saw that as an indictment of the narrowness of the profession. Now, the goal was then to get more Marxist economists tenured, to get them the right to express another point of view on the spectrum. And then, after the liberal arts were basically won over, I won't say taken over, they were basically won over by the PC and then the woke brigades. All of a sudden, I start reading in books. A professor shouldn't discuss both sides in the classroom. There was a professor who I quote at length in the book at Columbia. I won't name him, in the philosophy department.
Akil Morgana.
Excuse me? I'm not. Yeah. Who says it's stupid to tell both sides. Both sides can't be right. Only one side can be right. I decide in the quiet of my study, scrutinizing all the evidence, that the side I take is right. And therefore, there's no point in telling students the other side. I've decided what's true, and we shouldn't tell both sides. It wasn't just him. It was people like Joan Scott, who said things which I found even more deeply disturbing. They were carrying on just like the other side carried on when they went tenure on Marxist economists, because they, in the quiet of their study, had reached the conclusion that Marx was wrong, and therefore, why bother reading Das Kapital? What's the point? We have reached our determination in the privacy of our study, etc., and so on. That's not how you find truth. And what's 10,000 times worse, you're entitled to your opinion. But I don't believe you are entitled to deny your students the opportunity to figure out truth for themselves. You give the best case argument for both sides, with the acknowledgement that Mill makes that it's very hard for a person with strong convictions on one side to give the best case for the other side. But bearing that limitation in mind, I don't think you should be deciding truth for your students. I really don't. If I read a Supreme Court, teach Supreme Court law, and when I teach Supreme Court law, I make the best case for both sides. And I am absolutely emphatic that you have to read the dissents. Let's hear what their arguments are. If you read the same-sex marriage case, the dissent by Roberts in that case, it happened to be excellent. And we go through it, the whole class. We go through it line by line by line by line. And I ask the students, how do you add? Because, students are liberal. So, of course, they go along with Obergefell, the gay marriage case. But I ask them, how do you answer that argument? How do you answer that argument by Roberts? How do you answer that argument? I don't think you should just come in. You know what Mill said? He called it the assumption of infallibility. But you know what the assumption of infallibility is? It's not when you think you're right. That's not the assumption of infallibility. He says the assumption of infallibility is, and he put it in italics. He very rarely uses italics. He just counts on the power of his words. But he puts it in italics. It's when you decide for others what's true. That's the assumption of infallibility. And I find it highly problematic that after the left struggled to diversify, to use that word, academia and have other points of view on the faculty, now they're suddenly saying, now that they rule the roost, or did until November this past year, now that they rule the roost, we don't have to hear the other side. We know what's true. We don't have to present any other opinions. I find that very, very problematic.
I don't think there is anybody in this room that would disagree with you, by the way. Bruce.
I would like to defend academia a little bit. That is to say, Norman, I don't really accept your view based on this philosopher at Columbia whom I don't know, who seems to want to decide everything in the quiet of his study. It seems to me, first of all, there are certain issues which can't be divided, like a Supreme Court case, into pro and con, just two things. And often it seems to me that what happens in a classroom, classrooms I know, is something like, here's a hypothesis. Anybody want to shoot holes in it? I mean, do you know objections to it? And, it's not like racism. Are we for or against? Let's hear the for racism side. Sexism, for or against. Let's hear the pro sex. I mean, this is not a good example of what happens, right? So, I mean, I think the university is not quite as dumb as you're making it sound. That said, again, I go back to the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech being the big issue for the country at large, and academic freedom being more an issue for what's happening in institutions of higher education. You and I both admire Chomsky a lot. One of the things that Chomsky would do is point out the truth when people were telling lies. Another thing he would do was point out logical inconsistencies. And that's something I think you're very good at, and it needs to be done a whole lot. I give an example from Columbia. Our interim president, Claire Shipman, recently sent out an email to everybody in the university saying that the administration would not talk to the pro-Palestinian demonstrators because we do not talk to people who support violence. And I thought to myself, we don't talk to people who support violence? Let's consider that statement in light of the people that Claire Shipman does talk to every day, for example, on the board of trustees. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that we need. Norman Finkelstein's out there, all the friends of Chomsky pointing out. It's not a question of saying, I know the truth and here it is. It's just, you cannot say both of these things and get any intellectual respect. I wrote her a letter saying, you sound stupid. It's not good for the faculty at Columbia to have a president who sounds stupid. Could you get a better speechwriter? Someone who's not going to, anyway. But of course, that was a private letter.
Oh, any response to that letter yet?
No.
Just something Jim has been talking about in his blog recently is about, and I think, Norman, if I could just draw a conclusion from your book, is that there's an underlying, or maybe not even so underlying, attempt there to try to find a way of reinvigorating a left politics through the critiques that you make. Jim was talking about liberalism recently as a necessary component of a left politics. And I'm wondering if some of these, if we may have to go back to square one in a lot of ways, historically, with a left party or a left movement to really nail these issues down, it seems to me. That's a question or a statement.
I want to answer that. I'll try to answer both points, yours and Bruce Robbins. Bruce, with all due regard, you are the university professor. I was just a free floater in academia, occasionally getting an adjuncting position.
Can I just say really quickly how bad I feel that I have chosen the comfortable path and arrived in a very comfortable position when you made the space for me to be able to say the things that I can say without really paying a price. I'll just say that and then you go ahead.
Thank you. The only reason I mentioned that is as a point of principle, I always defer to expertise. You've been inside academia, you've been there for decades, you know how it operates, you know how it works. I'm a free floater. I just, whenever that I can get an adjuncting position, I would sees it, but it was rare. I think you have to agree that there was a lot of the criticism of the woke culture in academia was valid. Students, I talked to them, they felt so stifled in so many classes, terrified of dissenting from the party line. Even on things like, even in my classes where I try to be as open as possible, you have a lot of Latino and Latina students in the public colleges. They're first generation going to school. They are quite conservative. And when we do Roe v. Wade, it's very hard for them to say they don't support abortion. I finally get them to say it. I said, oh, come on, you don't. Why don't you say it? Let's have a real discussion about it. But there are so many issues, so many taboos, at least there were, that this notion that I'm sort of cherry picking when I took Joan Scott and the other person. I think it was representative of a mentality. It's with the mentality when you suddenly discover you're the majority, you're in charge, you're ruling the roost. And then suddenly you become like the other side was, and in most departments still is. In economics, you don't have any dissent in any university in this country. It's just a joke to talk about dissent, except in all technical points. All right, there's a few people like Jeffrey Sachs and others, but even Jeffrey Sachs, who I know, he wouldn't say he's a radical. He likes China because China has guaranteed a basic standard of living for the overwhelming number of people, and that's a huge historical achievement for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm never going to doubt that, but that's not my vision of an ideal society. So with such marginal exceptions, it feels like economics, it still is dominated by the old elites. But in general, it wasn't a positive experience for a lot of students to be in these classes. They were suffocating. They were party line, politically correct, and I think we should acknowledge that gave fuel to the Trump administration when he started to attack them. I believe the house cleaning should have been internal. It shouldn't have been external. But unfortunately, no internal critique was coming. I didn't see it. That's why people reacted. When I want to just say a simple point, and I want to get back to what the other question that came that was asked of me. When you read Ibram X. Kendi, everybody since the dawn of humankind, except him, Eldridge Cleaver, and Angela Davis, were racists. That's it. Everybody. The abolitionists, they were all racist. Frederick Douglass was a racist. Richard Wright was a racist. Everybody is a racist. This stuff, I remember Cornel West, and I was once talking to him during an interview, so it's not like behind closed doors. He says it's so, he has that drawl. It's so shallow. It's so shallow. And I was there was a new biography of Charles Sumner that came out recently. Yeah. And I was intrigued by the biography, and I started to read several biographies of him and started to read his speeches. It's an arduous task. It's 20 volumes, and that's only represents half of his output. 20 volumes is collected. He was such an extraordinary, magnificent human being. His very last words on his deathbed were, "Pass the Civil Rights Bill." He struggled his whole life. He gave it over to the cause. And at some personal cost, physical personal cost, and certainly from every day after a certain point, his life was on the line. And then when I read in Ibram X. Kendi, he calls the abolitionists, quote, the merry band of racists. You know, merry band of racists. It was such crap. What was being said by these people. I went through the Kendi book line by line in my books, line by line in my book. I couldn't find anything there that held up, that withstood even the most superficial scrutiny. And that stuff was being taught. It was being taught in
Small
schools.
objection. From what I know of the teaching of, let's say, African American studies at Columbia, that is absolutely not the mainstream of what is being taught. They're just, most people think that that is a crock. Okay? So just so you know, I mean, a more recent report on what's getting taught. I'm going to actually get myself in trouble by agreeing with you a little bit, but neither of us will like it. When I made a documentary film, some of my best friends are Zionists, and I interviewed Tony Kushner.
Wait, hold on for one moment. 1 second.
I can see where you're going with this, Bruce.
I'm not sure you can, actually, but
Okay. All right.
You'll tell me afterwards.
All right.
I want to get hold of those transcripts with Cornell West. Sorry, don't put that into the edited version. So I interviewed Tony Kushner, and I asked everybody in the film, what did you know? What did you think about Israel growing up? It was all Jews. What do you think now? And how did you get from point A to point B? So Tony Kushner grew up in Louisiana, and he said, it was just complete Zionist in my community. And I get to Columbia and I take, first year core curriculum, blah, blah, blah. And I realize that my teacher is critical of Israel. And I call my mother and I say, I can't believe this. What is going on? What kind of place is this that you sent me to? And he said, it took me a couple of years. And I realized, oh my God, there's kind of a point to it. So I think it's true. This is my analogy to your Latina students who are running into not a taboo, but pressure to consider a point of view that they didn't encounter where they grew up. And I do not think that is a bad thing.
Yeah, but here's the problem, Bruce. The other side doesn't get to hear another point of view. Those who are opposed to abortion, they're afraid to say it. So everybody else in the class, they don't get exposed to another point of view. And that to me is a problem. The people who are oppose abortion, they sit silently and, as it were, obediently. They don't protest. It's the other side that doesn't allow for free and open discussion of the topic. That to me is what makes it problematic. And I think I know from talking to students that they found there's a rule of thumb now. Don't take any course that has studies at the end of its title, because it's all woke and it's stifling and it's suffocating and it's not intellectual inquiry of any substantive sort, in my opinion. Now, I'm happy to hear you out. That's not, that's based on my experience in talking to students. And one of the advantages of being an adjunct, really it's a very small advantage, is you get to be on many different campuses.
Lucky you.
Can I add a footnote? Can I add a footnote to what Bruce said? Rutgers, the history department there is ranked nationally every year, like 1, 2, or 3 in African American history. I never heard anybody ever mention Kendi, nor Robin DiAngelo. It just wasn't, it's not even part of the thinking that goes into teaching there. So I'm with Bruce in thinking I don't know where this stuff gets taught, but it sure as hell doesn't get taught in real departments like history or complet.
It's in corporate. I mean, from my understanding, it was more in corporate environments. HR departments would pick it up as a way of dealing with diversity in the workplace.
Right.
That's a point, Norman, you make in the book, I think, right? That this has been a very popular corporate, banner to march under.
Right.
I wanted to just respond to the second question. One of the things in the history of the socialist communist tradition, I would say the person who most sincerely, authentically was committed to the idea of working people controlling their own lives in a real democratic, participatory, active way was Rosa Luxemburg. She was remarkable in this sense of how much attention she gave to that aspect of the socialist, Marxist, anarchist tradition. And one of the things she said is, of course, you have to let both sides or all sides speak, because working people need to learn how to reason through an argument. And that really struck me, that she understood that if you really believe you want workers to control their own lives, if you really believe in those maxims of the Marxist, socialist, communist, anarchist tradition, then you have to believe that people have to learn to think for themselves. You can't just tell them what is the party line. And therefore, she said, of course, we support the other side having the right to speak and freely express their opinion so as to enable ordinary people to learn how to reason through an argument. And that, to me, I thought was, you don't really find that in others, the people who are best known. I can't say rank and file. But I found it really, for me, it was exhilarating, because, as you said, here I'm quoting Mill. Mill is a liberal. Marx absolutely loathed him, I thought, unfairly, and heaped ridicule on him, I think, unfairly. And then it was sort of, as I say, exhilarating for me, where I saw that Rosa was making the same arguments about the importance of free speech and letting every side be heard, always recognizing that there will be severe constraints on it in a capitalist society, but not using those constraints as an excuse to either jettison free speech or, what's worse, add new limits on it, add new limitations on it, which is what happened during the whole woke era. Now it'll be limitations on the other side. I know that. Now it's going to be, too much about slavery. So we have to stop talking about that as much. It's funny when you hear Trump's people say that, because look, I was in junior high school. Long before wokeness and political correctness. But when we studied American history, and it was absolutely not woke, this was 64, 63, 65, I don't know. I'm talking about junior high when I was in 7th grade. When we studied it, we learned about the Missouri Compromise, we learned about Kansas, Nebraska. The whole curriculum was about slavery. Not because they were woke, but because that was a core issue in our country. But now the other side is going to impose its version of wokeness, and that's going to be another problem. It's another problem. But I don't think the fact that I don't like their version should be grounds for saying it was okay before. No, it was not okay before. I recognize you're right. Columbia, I can't speak for Rutgers, but Columbia has a distinguished history of teaching history. Its department, an American history, was always the strongest in our country, with people like, obviously, people like Hofstadter and many others. And it was very impressive, very impressive up until most recently. The last incarnation was Eric Foner. So very impressive. And I've corresponded with some of them. Again, I won't name names. I've corresponded with some of them, and they did not have anything positive to say about Kendi. On the other hand, he had a $10 million endowed chair at Boston University. So I find it hard to conclude that he was just an aberration.
Okay, I'm not the moderator here. Everybody agrees to this. And yet, I'm going to say something in the mode of moderation. I think it would be tragic if we let the opportunity pass by of talking about the weaponizing of anti-Semitism here, something about which we all have strong feelings, and anybody listening to this would probably also have strong feelings. If this were all about wokeness, it would be like letting Norman Finkelstein go to waste here. So, I mean, fine, I think we've said it. I just wonder whether the moderators, who are better at moderating than I am, can find something to ask about that so as to get that going a little bit. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, that's
I'm a little short on time, but I would like to make a brief comment. I think we're already at we're approaching 3:30, if I'm not mistaken.
oh yeah.
Let me just, I'm going to make a few brief remarks about it, and maybe we can come back again and just have a really substantive conversation about the question. I recently was on a panel with Nadine Strossen and Cornel West on the issue of free speech, and the issue I brought up because I was the moderator. I brought up on the issue of anti-Semitism on the college campuses. And most of what I would have to say, you would all be familiar with. But since Bruce Robbins stated that he's not a free speech absolutist, I will say that two issues came up in the course of my conversation with Dr. West and Nadine Strossen. The first issue was a general one. Do war criminals have a right to free speech on college campus? And the specific case came up at Columbia of when Hillary Clinton came to speak, and there were efforts made to interrupt her. I personally, I'm of the opinion that allowing certified war criminals who, due to the limitations of our legal system, never had to face the consequences of their acts, I do think there's a question mark as to whether they should have the right to free speech, because I consider it a desecration of the dead. And I may be old-fashioned about those things, and you may say, that doesn't sound to me like a resolute atheist when you start talking about desecration of the dead. But I think the notion of honoring the dead is not alien to the left tradition. I remember when I read the wonderful 2-volume biography of Marx's daughter, Eleanor Marx. It was Yvonne Kopp who wrote it. And she made a point that the Marx daughters, all of whom were in their father's political trajectory, they made a point of making sure there are always flowers at his gravesite. And that struck me. Wait, aren't these militant atheists? Why do they care about flowers? Their father is dead. He's dead and gone. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. No, you honor the memory of the dead. And it's a desecration of that memory when you allow a war criminal who has a large number of skeletons in their closet on the order sometimes, in the case of someone like Henry Kissinger, millions, to allow them to speak. So that's
not just allow them to speak, but invite them to teach
invite them.
at Columbia.
Invite them to teach, right. And then there was a second issue that came up. And the second issue was, if you read the Harvard report on anti-Semitism, there were two reports, one on anti-Semitism and one on anti-Muslim, Palestinian and other sentiment. If you read the Harvard report on anti-Semitism, it runs like 350 pages. If you place it under a high-power magnifying glass, there's just nothing there. If you look at the examples they come up with, somebody at the encampment had a picture of President Garber as if he were the devil. Yes, and they call that a graphic, extreme case of anti-Semitism. Then they espied, E-S-P-I-E-D, they espied a map of Palestine that didn't include Jewish areas. And that was another egregious case of anti-Semitism. Well, as you can see, it was very slim pickings. There was some crazy wokeness, like in some classes in the Harvard School of Divinity and in some divisions of the Harvard School of Public Health. They were teaching how to de-Zionize the Jewish mind. Okay, complete crap, but it's not anti-Semitism, is it? It's woke idiocy. It's like Robin DiAngelo, I'm going to interrupt racism. What can that possibly mean? When anyone says something racist, you go, boo, racism. I'm going to interrupt racism. It's complete nonsense. So then you ask yourself the question, what filled those 340 pages? When their examples were so, as Woody Guthrie used to say, when he reads his soup was so thin that he could read the morning paper through it. And their examples were so thin that. So what is it? And the key comes when they define anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? They say what anti-Semitism for the purposes of this commission is, task force, for the purposes of this task force, anti-Semitism is when Israeli Jews feel shunned on college campus. That was the core, the heart of anti-Semitism. They felt shunned. And Harvard said its mission is to be inclusive and pluralistic. And you must be inclusive of the Israeli Jewish students so we can build a pluralistic, inclusive culture here. And I said, no, I think you should shun baby killers. I think it's a desecration of the dead to another level when these baby killers come to college here and you go out. As I said to Dr. West, who I consider a friend, but Dr. West has a very big tent. It stretches from here to Pluto. And he didn't like what I had to say. And I said to him, boy, I said, you support cavorting and carousing with baby killers, with starvers of children, with murderers who target children, journalists, and medics, with individuals who systematically bomb hospitals and schools and mosques. Of course, they should be shunned. Or you have lost your humanity, I'm sorry to say. If you even have to think twice about being inclusive of those monsters, you lose me. Now, I can imagine some thoughts running through several of your heads because you're professors and you're wondering, but what if they're in my class? How am I supposed to conduct myself? Should I stop smiling at them? Should I not make eye contact with them? Should I not say good point if they make a good point? Should I, and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to say, in real life, there are some insoluble dilemmas. However, granting that fact, there is no way on God's earth I am carousing and cavorting with baby killers. That would be the most outrageous betrayal of my parents' own martyrdom to carry on like that. Now, I'll tell you, as a point of personal biography, by some happenstance, I ended up at a trial in the gallery with some of the guards, the female guards, in the concentration camp, Majdanek, where my mother was incarcerated. And she was one of the witnesses at the trial in Dusseldorf. Now, without going into the details of that experience, if I were to follow what Harvard was now demanding of its student body, I shouldn't have killed that guard, which is what my mother wanted. I will be perfectly honest about that. She wanted me to kill the guard. I should have said, but Mom, you've got to be inclusive. Let's invite the guard to join us at the local pub for a beer. Now, you're laughing, Bruce, but that's what Harvard was saying. You might not like it when I make that analogy, but that's what Harvard was saying. And that, to me, is positively sick.
This is a conversation, it seems to me, that we should have separately. I mean, do another session with you, if that's okay. Could we do that?
Sure. But I have to take off now because I have another appointment.
Right, I do too, yeah. So,
But thank you for inviting me. And I'm sorry to end on that note because I don't give anyone a chance to respond.
Actually, it was a very eloquent note to end on.
yeah.
I think you shouldn't be sorry.
And there's the book in general, if anyone picks it up, there's a lot to pull from it. So I didn't expect to get to, like Bruce wanted to talk about, the last bit. I think that's probably a good springboard into the next one. And we can pick up some of it.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Thanks, Nora.
Bye-bye.